Imagine this. A quiet monastery garden in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A monk in a habit kneels beside pea beds and carefully records the shapes and colors of flowers. His brothers think he's engaged in ordinary gardening, but this man is working on something that will change the world of science forever. His name is Gregor Mendel. He never received the Nobel Prize. During his lifetime, almost no one understood his work. He died thinking his records would remain unnoticed forever. And today, we call him the father of modern genetics. How did one Augustinian monk, a man who devoted his life to prayer and serving God, become the founder of one of the most important scientific disciplines? And why was his story forgotten for so long? This is the story of Gregor Mendel, the monk who discovered the laws that God inscribed into the very nature of life. This is a continuation of our series, People of Faith, in which we discover the wisdom of saints, scientists, and great minds. If you want more stories like this, write in the comments who you'd like us to cover next. His real name was Johann Mendel. He was born on July 20th, 1822, in the small village of Heinzendorf, in what is now the Czech Republic. His family were poor peasants. Father Anton and Mother Rosine barely survived from their small estate. But Johann was different. Even as a child, he showed incredible curiosity about nature. He observed plants, clouds, animals. He asked questions. He wanted to understand how the world works. The local parish priest noticed his talent and recommended him for high school. But then begins Mendel's first struggle, the struggle for education. His family had no money. Johann had to give private lessons to survive. He was often hungry. Due to hunger and stress, he had to interrupt his schooling several times. Imagine a young man dreaming of knowledge without even enough for bread. At 21 years old, Johann makes a decision that will change his life. He joins the Augustinian Monastery of St. Thomas in Brno. Why? Not only because of a spiritual calling, it was also practical. In the monastery he had food, a roof over his head, and most importantly, access to books and science. When he entered the order, he took the name Gregor. But remember, his decision to become a monk was not an escape from science. It was a path toward science. The monastery of St. Thomas in Brno was not an ordinary monastery. It was an intellectual center. Its abbot, Cyril Knapp, believed that monks should be educated, that they must serve the world with both prayer and knowledge. The monastery had a large library, a laboratory, and a garden that would later become legendary. Here we see something many forget today. The Catholic Church was not an enemy of science. It was precisely many monks who were its greatest drivers. Around 1849, Mendel begins teaching at a high school in Znaim. A year later, he takes the state exam for teachers and fails. Why? He was too nervous. This brilliant mind, which would one day change the world, couldn't withstand the pressure of the examiners at that time. But Abbot Knapp didn't give up on him. He sent him to the University of Vienna, where Gregor Mendel studied natural sciences, physics, botany, and mathematics. Here he learned something crucial: how to apply mathematics to natural phenomena. This would be the secret of his future success. While other botanists merely described plants, Mendel would count and measure them. He returned to Brno and began teaching physics and natural sciences. But his mind couldn't rest. He began experimenting. In 1856, Mendel began his famous experiment in the modest monastery garden. What was he doing? Growing peas. Sounds boring, doesn't it? A monk growing peas. But behind it was a brilliant plan. Why peas? Mendel didn't choose peas randomly. He was like a scientist carefully choosing his instrument, Peas were perfect because they grow quickly, so he could get several generations in 1 year. They have clear, visible characteristics: tall or short plants, yellow or green pods, smooth or wrinkled seeds. Pollination is easily controlled, so he could precisely control which flower pollinates which. Mendel obtained 34 different varieties of peas. He grew them for 2 years, just to check which were pure, that is, which always produced the same characteristic. Here's what Mendel did. He took peas with smooth seeds and peas with wrinkled seeds. He crossed them. What happened? All plants of the first generation had smooth seeds. Others would have said, well, the smooth characteristic is stronger, and stopped there. But not Mendel. He continued. He crossed those first generation plants with each other. And then, a miracle. In the second generation, wrinkled seeds returned, but not all. Mendel counted them and discovered something incredible. The ratio was 3 to 1. 3 smooth to 1 wrinkled. Always. He repeated the experiment, and each time he got the same ratio. Mendel realized something revolutionary. Inheritance is not random. It's not mixing colors as other scientists thought. There are laws, mathematical laws. Each plant carries 2 factors for each characteristic, which we call genes today, 1 from each parent. Some factors are dominant, like smooth seeds. Some are recessive, like wrinkled seeds. For Mendel, this wasn't just a scientific law. It was proof of God's design. God didn't create chaos. He created order. Order that we can discover, understand, and marvel at. People often don't realize what a huge task this was. Mendel grew and analyzed more than 28,000 pea plants. He had to plant, care for, pollinate, count, and record each one. 8 years, 8 summers and winters. In quiet hours between prayers and teaching, a monk who served God through prayer, but also by discovering his secrets in nature. February 8th, 1865. The Natural History Society in Brno. A small hall, a quiet evening. Gregor Mendel stands before a group of local scientists and begins his presentation. Experiments on plant hybrids. He reads for an hour, then another. In total, 2 hours. He presents laws that will later change the world. The audience's reaction? Silence. No one asked a question. No one understood the importance of what they had just heard. A year later, Mendel's work was published in a journal. The journal was sent to more than 120 institutions throughout Europe and America, to university libraries in Berlin, London, Paris. But no one reacted. If they read it, they didn't understand. Why? Mendel was ahead of his time. Scientists didn't yet know about DNA, chromosomes, or the mechanisms of inheritance. Moreover, Mendel used mathematics and statistics, and the biology of that era was more descriptive than numerical. And third, the world was then captivated by Darwin. All eyes were on evolution. Mendel was an unnoticed shadow. He tried to establish contact with big names. He wrote to Carl Nägeli, one of the most famous botanists of his time. Nägeli replied, coldly, almost contemptuously. He suggested he try other plants, because peas, he said, were not representative enough. Mendel obeyed him. He tried hawkweed, but that plant wasn't so simple. The experiments failed. Slowly, Mendel was losing hope. The monk who had found order in nature was now watching as the world remained silent about his discovery. In 1868, Mendel was elected abbot of the Monastery of St. Thomas, a great honor, but also the end of his scientific career. As abbot, he had to manage the monastery, finances, estates. He also had to be a politician. He clashed with the government over taxes imposed on monasteries. His time for research vanished. Mendel became lonely, fat. He suffered from kidney problems. He smoked too much. His great work lay forgotten in libraries throughout Europe. The pea plants in the garden had been replaced with other things. He often told his monks, "My time will come." But he wasn't sure. He died on January 6, 1884, at the age of 61. Local newspapers praised him as a good abbot, a dedicated teacher, a worthy citizen. Not a word about his scientific work, not a word about peas, not a word about the laws of inheritance. He left thinking he had failed. 16 years after Mendel's death, something incredible happened. 3 scientists, independently of each other, in 3 different countries, came to the same conclusions as Mendel. Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Correns in Germany, Erich von Tschermak in Austria. All were conducting experiments with plants. All got the same 3-to-1 ratio. All formulated similar laws. And then, when they were preparing their papers for publication, each of them searched the existing literature, and they all found Mendel. Imagine their feeling. They thought they had discovered something new, revolutionary, and then they discover that some unknown Augustinian monk had preceded them 35 years earlier. De Vries tried not to mention Mendel, but Correns and Tschermak were honest. They published that Mendel deserved to be mentioned. Suddenly, Mendel's work became a sensation. His work was translated into many languages. Mendel's factors were later called genes. Today we learn about Mendel in every school. Every biology student knows his laws. He's called the father of genetics. But he never received that recognition. He died thinking his research would never be acknowledged. That's the sad part of the story, but also inspirational. When we now try to round up all these things we mentioned in the video into one beautiful whole, we realize that Mendel was a deeply faithful man, a devoted monk. He spent hours in prayer, but that didn't prevent him from being a scientist. On the contrary, his faith encouraged him to research. For him, studying nature was studying God's creation. Every law he discovered was another proof of God's wisdom. There is no conflict between faith and science. There is only conflict between bad faith and bad science. Mendel was ignored during his lifetime. His work was forgotten. He died in anonymity. But the truth couldn't be hidden forever. The laws he discovered were real, and when others came to the same conclusions, Mendel's work was resurrected. Truth has its own power. It doesn't need PR campaigns. It doesn't need recognition. Mendel didn't work in a large university laboratory. He didn't have a wealthy patron. He wasn't part of the scientific elite. He worked in a small garden, in a provincial town, in the silence of a monastery. Some of the greatest discoveries come from the most unexpected places, from those who work quietly, patiently, without the world's attention. Mendel grew peas for 8 years. It was slow, laborious, methodical work, but that was precisely the secret of his success. He didn't rush. He didn't seek quick results. He was patient. Great works require time. Mendel experienced many failures. He failed the teaching exam. His work was ignored. His correspondence with Nägeli led nowhere. But he didn't give up. He kept working. He kept believing. And in the end, although he didn't live to see it, his works were recognized. Gregor Mendel died in anonymity, but today we know the truth. He was one of the greatest scientists in history, a monk who served God through prayer and through discovering the laws that God inscribed into the very fabric of life. His story teaches us that truth doesn't die. Great works often come from quiet places. Faith and reason can walk together. Patience and dedication bring results. Next time you eat peas, or when you hear the word genetics, remember the man in the habit, Gregor Mendel, monk, scientist, father of genetics, the man who discovered how God writes the code of life. My time will come. And it did. If you liked this video, like and subscribe. Comment below. Have you heard of Mendel? What do you think of his story? See you in the next video.